let me ask you this, and I had this as one of the first kind of questions. You start off by saying that Pedro Castillo, and I think rightfully so, was kind of being heralded here in the West as a victory, because also he gets elected around the same time that there's still a lot of hope around Bernie Sanders here in the States. He gets in office, doesn't last long. As you say, he's not in prison yet, is he?
Yes, he is impressionate, and I think it is kind of complex, like his figure, because well, it's true that in the beginning of the protest, some protesters reclaimed the his release from prison and his reinstatement as president. Like, what is also true is that when the protests started getting repressed, it generates a larger confluence that
Mhm.
generated that people that did not vote for Pedro Castillo either in the first round or in the second round started to go out to the streets. And this was a protest that was massive, particularly in much more in the regions rather than in Lima, which it was much slow, the protest. And I think that there has been, um, I think in a way, the kind of he became like very difficult to defend, and I am not think that is also like the best strategy to defend, but the disinterest that we see toward what is going in Peru is kind of complex, because um it's still like I think what one could say about Peru, and I think probably there is still some people of all places, like for example the Council of Foreign Relations, which normally is not sympathetic to progressive politics per se,
Mhm.
seems to be having a relatively positive view of the protest, in the sense like I think from some strategic vision, they also think that this kind of reactionary patriotic socialist pack is going to be much more pro-China in a way, because kind of anti-wokeism coalition.
Mhm.
But also, I think it has to be that that some of the people that because these kind of organizations that are a bit larger are able to put some people on the ground. I think even the New York Times and the Washington Post, which in sometimes have, like particularly lately, having much more reactionary positions on other topics, um, have try to be at least a bit more honest about like what is going on, because a great part of the mainstream media has basically purged any kind of critical vision, and the mainstream media in Peru has much more of a conservative leaning, which has cons- a constriction in its coverage. So, for example, when it was revealed like the current president Dina Boluarte had a collection of Rolex watches, like that amounts for thousands of dollars.
Mhm.
It was revealed by independent media, and this has been one of the largest news in the last days. I mean, it has been covered in publications around like the U.S. and Europe, that were kind of like forgetting Peru, but because of this news, like kind of got in the news. I think even publications in Dutch and Japanese have covered. So yeah, it's kind
Well,
of wild.
would you call Dina Boluarte a Marxist Leninist? She comes from the Marxist Leninist Party, or is that
No,
just where she's at?
I think it is curious. Like I think I used to think like her relationship with the left was much more frail. At this point, I think like his brother is his relationship with the left. I think his brother is a very curious character that seems to be much more linked to the left, but that
Mhm.
in the last years was having a much more pragmatic turn, and kind of maybe ditching a bit of of his original position, more pragmatic, but as maintain some sort of populist rhetoric. And and he seems to try to inscribe his own party. So Dina Boluarte seems much more of a reformist, but he was either not not particularly woke or anything, just that maybe she was seen as less extremist in her rhetoric as Pedro Castillo, although, as I think I have mentioned before, and I think even when talking with C. Eric Barr, I was telling him that Pedro Castillo for moments sounded almost libertarian in some issues, but despite that, in that sense, she sounded much more moderate, and she was much more moderate in the way she approached the the debates and the political campaign in the first round, but he was but she was kind of a much more moderate in theory. But what he has seen is like basically an alliance, um with the kind of like the corrupt of the pack of the corrupt, like with the groups of power, and with the I think this question is interesting. Why does Pedro Castillo was described as a progressive populist? Um, I think it has to do like that the rival was Keiko Fujimori, and that like Castillo was more pro vax. I guess like was more pro increasing the social safety net, and was at least in rhetoric pro union. So I think in that sense, I think he had some of the elements of the rhetoric, but it was not as strong as some would have expected.
I wanted to
Pascal.
ask you a question about Dina Bolarte. I remember when she was running, she ran on a very kind of like anti-native, almost kind of like Christian nationalist rhetoric as well. How was it you're saying that she was progressive when I noticed particularly that she was trying to almost act as if she was a reaction to the embrace of the indigenous nature of Peruvian people coming out of Pedro Castillo?
Yeah, I think the curious thing is that like she was her vice presidential candidate, and she speaks in Quechua, and that sometimes when she's criticized, she denounced racism. So I think in a way, like what you mentioned is correct. I think she was much more uh, moderate in a way, but in some sense also more reactionary, like maybe moderate, like not. I think I don't think I think the relationship of the left, I think like what someone has mentioned, like what the relationship with Shining Path and the Emirate, yeah, I think that is a complicated story, because like the Shining Path and the Emirate, yeah, attacked like the organized left, so literally like some part of the organized left die in the years of the internal conflict. So um the reorganization of what it was remaining of that left like was very weakened, and kind of even regionalized, because like very different regions have kind of in a way different tendencies. Like you have in the region, for example, from where Pedro Castillo is, you still had some sort of forms of cooperativism, like kind of like agrarian cooperatives, like that have maybe that probably explains why his rhetoric is a bit more pro market in a strange way, because like obviously cooperatives try to compete in the market, and try to sell stuff within the market, um while in other areas like much more rural, like kind of like the production was much more communitarian, so like on a communal basis, and kind of like of self subsistence. So I think like a lot of those the diversity of the expressions within the Peruvian left were never kind of consolidated within one party, and that was even when in the 80s, like Peru had a larger left than Brazil, like in number of parties, and percentage per capita of the population involved in left wing politics. So it is curious because now, like, a lot of the, even the critics of the left now, they come from the left, which is kind of strange. Um, I think that in a way Dina Boluarte is the face of a conservative reaction against Pedro Castillo, and as you mentioned, kind of the attempt of Peru to return to its indigenous roots. Uh, but also, I think it's kind of particularly lately. I think the press that to some degree was sympathetic in because they were much more right leaning with the ousting of Pedro Castillo, have been much more critical lately because I think she's still not as far right enough for them, and I think that the constraints that there are, because the election is going to be in 2026, so in 2 years, like, there is going to be a very like convoluted scene, because there are a lot of parties and there is going to be much more fraction of the vote, like, so probably the two candidates that are going to pass to the second round are going to have less than 20%, so like the representativity is going to be very low.